Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, if you're hoping to ring in the new year with an ice cold craft beer instead of champagne, well, you're in luck. 20 years ago, it would have been hard to find a bar with a wide selection of local brews on tap, but now we're in a brewery boom. All this week, we're revisiting some of our favorite food and drink episodes from the year. And today, we're bringing back a conversation lead producer Megan Harris and I had with CityCast contributor Hal B, Klein, breaking down why locals are hopping to start breweries. It's Wednesday, December 28th. I'm Morgan Moody, and this is CityCast Pittsburgh.
Hal, you've been talking a lot about this brewery boom lately. How many breweries do we have in Pittsburgh or Allegheny County?
So I think right now we're at 45. We might be at 46 because Coven Brewery might have just actually gotten its licensing. So we might have one more.
That's a good thing, right?
I think so, yeah. You know, I one of the brewers I spoke with the story, Lauren Hughes, who's the head brewer at Necromancer Brewery, I asked her, I was like, do you feel like we're getting overloaded? And she's like, no, if we want to be a brewery destination, if we want to be a place where people see Pittsburgh as a place to go to enjoy breweries, both for people that live here and for people that might want to spend a weekend here from, surrounding cities, the more the better, the more the merrier.
But it hasn't always been like that. So could you kind of take us back to what it was like when Pittsburgh was not as rich in breweries as we are now?
Yeah, it's a wild history. When I started looking into this, it just kind of astounded me because it's so commonplace right now. Not just that we're going to the breweries themselves, but when you go to a bar, when you go to a restaurant, you really expect to see a lot of local beer on tap. And I think that's what people want. But even just 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. And 20 years ago, that absolutely wasn't the case. So you look back, and so we have Pittsburgh Brewing Company, the brewers of Iron City and Icy Light Mango. That are still popular. And still, there is a place, there's absolutely a place for a macro brewed beer, hot summer day, baseball, whatever.
You are being so kind.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's something for it, I think sometimes. Or, I know when I'm at Chengdu Gourmet and I'm eating spicy Szechuan food, I want a lager like that. I think that's the best combination. That is the prime combination. Either a white wine that you think is maybe a little too sweet or a macro brewed lager. That's what you want at a restaurant like that.
Pairings by Hal Klein. I love this.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, it's not just about brewers. I'm here for the recommendations of what to drink.
But Prohibition happened and mucked everything up, but we were still exclusively a shot in a beer town through at least our parents' generation.
I mean, we still kind of are, but the beers are better.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm kidding. Hal, what rules or laws changed that switched things up for us?
So in the late 70s, Congress passes a law that basically says if you're a small brewery, you're not going to be charged the same rate as an industrial brewer, because that's what really kept things from taking off, because it just wasn't financially responsible. In the late 80s here, you get Penn Brewery, and that's the first brew pub, I think, in the state of Pennsylvania. And so for the next 20 years or so, you get a couple of those things open. So Church Brew Works is another one that's still around. But these are places that are breweries that are attached to restaurants. So they're technically restaurants that have a brewery license. And then in 2004, Scott Smith, who runs East End Brewing in Larimer, decides he wants to, he was a home brewer, he was an engineer, he was sick of his job, classic story through the decades. And he decides he wants to sell craft brewed beer for retail sale. And he had to really work with the state to, the Allegheny County Health Board wasn't sure how to license it at first. And so step by step, he gets this licensing. He goes door to door. Kelly's puts him on tap. They're the first bar to put him on tap with a beer called Big Hop, which is still on tap there. And that's the first time people start brewing beer. And then slowly you start seeing Voodoo in Meadville a year later. But it's really in the mid 2010s that you start seeing breweries start to pop up around Pittsburgh. And then a couple years later, because the laws were sort of muddy, like you could sample beer and maybe sell a sample for $1, but that wasn't really legal. And it was more just to get growlers out the door. So that was the big development back then.
I remembered in farmers markets in particular, like you could really get like a sample of anything. And it was sort of sketchy as to like what they were checking and what they weren't for.
Bathtub beer, bathtub brewed beer.
Yeah, and the idea was more, have a sample of this beer and then you're going to buy a growler. It wasn't really about like hanging out and drinking beers in a certain space. It was about getting a growler. And even back then you had to have, if you wanted an East End beer, you had to have a growler from East End. If you wanted a Hop Farm beer, you had to have a growler from Hop Farm. And growlers, for people that don't know, are basically 64-ounce containers that they would fill up, seal, you take it home.
So you have to be really committed to that particular style of beer.
Yeah, you have to be committed to the style of beer. You have to be committed to going to that brewery. And then, so then we start getting laws that are basically like brew pub licenses. So you can open a brewery, but you have to have 30 seats and what they said was like legitimate food, which was a really sort of hazy description of what that was. But generally, it would mean something that you would think of as a meal. So a couple years later, they clarified that law in what's colloquially known as the bag of chips law, which says you have to have 10 seats and a snack food such as a bag of chips. And that really opens up the door for people to start having spaces that they don't have to have, full entertainment, full things, full kitchens, everything like that.
The way you're saying it is like you can get beer pretty much everywhere, or at least like that's the expectation. But who are we getting it all from? I feel like it's typically like a bunch of white guys with beards, like the hipster guy that has quit his job and now has like embarked on brewing.
Yeah, and the flannel. You can't forget the flannel.
Yeah, and the flannel.
Yeah, that's the stereotype, right? And, I think that is a lot of the foundation for sure of Pittsburgh craft beer. A lot of it came out of homebrew clubs, which were a space that were largely dominated by white dudes, often in flannel, often bearded. And that's still, I think that's still largely the case. But I think what we're seeing over the last few years is a real effort in Pittsburgh to diversify that space and diversify more, I think, who the spaces are for at this point than who's actually brewing the beer. But you're starting to see it on that end as well. So you're starting to see people like the Pittsburgh Brewing Diversity Council that are people that are not maybe typically people that would make up that space, asking those questions and saying, how can we expand this? How can we expand opportunities? Trace Brewing in Bloomfield has a vocational training program that is really incredible. When they opened, they committed. They realized, hey, let's open this space up a little bit more. And the key to do that is to actually mentor some people. And so now we're starting to see the seeds of that planted. And we're starting to see, I mentioned Coven at the top of this. And
Katie Sullivan, I think, is who you're talking about at Coven, right?
That's right. She's only the second woman to be a head brewer in Pittsburgh. But I think it's going to show that that's starting to happen. You're starting to see assistant brewers at places, general managers in places that are running breweries. And so, hopefully that's a thing that's going to really start to change over the years.
Right.
And then, when you talk about Dave Bracey and Barrel and Flow Fest, the fact that the country's first Black Brew Festival was founded in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Really says something. And it really says something about the attendance of that festival, the fact that people are hyped about it, the fact that it's going on. And, when I talked to Dave for this story, he also really talked about the fact that a lot of the things that you don't think about in beer, such as who is creating the labels for the cans of beer.
Right, the artists.
Yeah. Like those spaces are starting to be opened up as well. And I think that's pretty exciting. But there is also a long way to go,
I've been to a couple of, it used to be, Beer Fest, and then it changed into,
Fresh Fest.
Fresh Fest.
Fresh Fest.
Yeah.
And then it changed into Barrel and Flow. It's very cool.
So how would you say the pandemic has affected all of this? Are people still flocking to breweries? It sounds like they're certainly opening, but are enough people going to them?
I think so. I think you're seeing, as with a lot of spaces, the ebb and flow of it. So breweries did have the advantage, a lot of them, of having these outdoor spaces. I remember last winter at this time being really into Spring Hill Brewery because they had these amazing fire pits set up and they basically just would give you piles of wood and you could just sit out with your friends and just make these fires. And it was really cool. And it was such a cool space too. And, you're overlooking the city and everything like that. And so I think you're seeing that. I think you're seeing, you saw Dancing Gnome open a huge new space in Sharpsburg right in the middle of this pandemic. You're seeing breweries open still. And then I think one of the things that's exciting, circling back to the artists and the labels, is with the canning, it used to be a lot harder to get cans of beers and get a canning line at your brewery. And so now breweries can either have canning lines there, get mobile canning lines to come to them, which means that they're able to sell what is, kind of a real industrial product in some sense in other places. And then, taps at bars and everything like that.
Okay, let's end on something for the people. Hal, what beer or brewery are you loving right now? You know all the good places.
Oh man, that was what was really fun for this story was, getting to try all this beer. I love Trace. I think everything about what they're doing is great and their beer is really wonderful. Strange Root, which is a brewery that's been around for a very long time. I think they started in 2011. They were called Dry Log back then. They make really interesting, wild fermented beers. I liked Old Thunder Brewing in Blanox. And what's exciting about them too is they represent a second generation of breweries. So they started all of them at the Brew Gentleman in Braddock, who also make fantastic beer.
And if drinking's not your thing, there's more to do than just drink.
But there's so much going on at these spaces too. There's so much entertainment in various forms. And, sure, if you're into crushing beer, you can go and crush a beer, but there are also these social spaces that offer a lot more. And I think that's what distinguishes breweries it's what distinguishes your corner brewery from your corner bar, I think, is your corner brewery is more of a space that's going to be a space for everyone to come and hang out, whereas your corner bar might be a space that you might want to stay until 2 a.m. And breweries tend to not be open that late.
Yeah. Well, they're really family friendly too. Like a lot of them have like high chairs and, they're ready for your dogs. They have water bowls out and treats at the bar and they're kind of stocked for that sort of thing.
Yeah. They're great like that. It's different. And I think that also helps contribute to why we're seeing these spaces, why we're seeing a much broader array of people in these spaces is because they're spaces that are designed to be welcoming to everyone.
Thanks, Hal.
Thanks for chatting.
Hal B. Klein is a CityCast contributor. He covered our city's brewery boom for Pittsburgh Magazine. Now he's the senior food writer at the Post-Gazette. That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our Hey Pittsburgh newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city, so we'll see you then. Okay, all right,
Yeah.